In most stories, Anne Boleyn was born at the Boleyn-owned Hever Castle in the Weald of Kent. However, she was actually born in Norfolk, probably in the Boleyn home. Anne had an older sister, Mary, who was at one point King Henry VIII's mistress, and a younger brother, George. The Boleyn children were born of noble births. Their father, Thomas Boleyn, was the eldest son of Sir William Boleyn of Bickling, and their mother, Elizabeth Howard, was the daughter of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey. Anne was therefore the granddaughter of an earl and the daughter of a baron, making her better born than all three of King Henry's other English wives. Not only did Anne have the advantage of a noble birth, but her father's success as a courtier also laid a foundation for their eventual peak in power. His courtier status was especially important because in this era there was a sort of personal monarchy in which the king's word was law, and those in the king's favor were in the most powerful positions. In 1513, Anne Boleyn was sent to be finished at the Hallesburg court at Mechlin in Brabant. There Anne served as a maid of honor to Margaret of Austria. Thankfully, Margaret was very pleased with Anne and wrote to her father, "I find her so bright and pleasant for her young age that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you are to me." From the influence of the highly cultured and educated Margaret, Anne developed an eye for the Franco-Flemish art style, which included paintings such as the Très riche Heures du Duc de Berry. She was also exposed to music composed by the likes of Pierre de la Rue, Antoine Primet, and Jacques des Prés. However, Anne's time with Margaret lasted only until 1514, when Anne joined her sister to serve Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, during her marriage to Louis XII. This arrangement only lasted until Louis's death in early 1515. Rather than return with her sister and the others to England, or even back to Margaret of Austria, Anne stayed in France to serve the new French king's wife, Queen Claude. There Anne stayed for nearly 7 years. In 1521, arrangements were made for Anne to marry James Butler. Thus, Anne was sent back to England, though the marriage plans were eventually called off. In 1522, Anne made her English court debut at a pageant in March, where she played the role of Perseverance, and her sister Mary played Kindness. As Eric Ives states, they were roles of historic appropriateness. Early on in her time at the English court, while she was in the service of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne became involved with Henry Percy, who was the heir to the earldom of Northumberland, and currently in the service of the Wolsey household. Henry Percy would often visit the Queen's quarters, and he and Anne eventually grew fond of each other and intended to marry. But when Percy spoke to the Cardinal Wolsey about such plans, Wolsey dismissed it, claiming Anne was born too low of birth and such a match was insulting. Henry Percy cried and defended Anne's suitability, but alas, they were separated. Henry Percy was married off and Anne was sent away to Hever, and from this incident began Anne's irrefutable hatred for Cardinal Wolsey. During her time at Hever, a poet by the name of Thomas Wyatt, whose family estate was nearby, fell in love with Anne. For a while, nothing became of this but a few poems, but years later it would end Thomas Wyatt's life. Eric Ives explains that an abortive marriage with Butler, a failed romance with Henry Percy, and a flirtation with Thomas Wyatt hardly made the early 1520s a success for Anne. But in 1526 things changed. Henry VIII had by this time stopped seeing Anne's sister Mary, and in 1526 an interest in Anne herself bloomed. From there on, two things progressed. The first was the motion for King Henry to divorce Catherine of Aragon, who, already in her 40s, had failed to produce any male heirs and had not conceived in nearly a decade. The second was the king's relationship with Anne, which further prompted his desire for a divorce. To achieve the annulment, Henry had to give the Pope a good reasoning to set aside Catherine. To do this, Henry presented a passage from the Bible. "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He shall be without children." To Henry, this was irrefutable proof. He had married his late brother's wife. They were childless, since all their sons had died. So with this, by May 1527, Henry took the first steps to divorce Catherine of Aragon. While this motion moved forward, so did Anne and Henry's relationship. This relationship can be chronicled in a series of 17 unique love letters, in which Henry first asked Anne to be his permanent mistress, which she refused, and later he asked Anne to be his new queen and wife, which, of course, she accepted. Shortly after the agreement of marriage, in August 1527, Henry officially asked the Pope for dispensation to free Henry and Anne to marry. Unfortunately for Anne and Henry, an annulment of Henry's marriage was politically impossible, and would only result in putting the Pope and many other parties in a difficult situation. And while Henry dealt with the Pope, who continuously delayed any response to Henry's request, Anne was having a fight of her own. Catherine of Aragon had huge amounts of support both from the English common and within the court. Those who supported the necessity for divorce looked for a more suitable queen, who would cement international alliances rather than satisfy royal passions. As Eric Ives put it, a different woman might have responded by ignoring the critics and trusting her own attractions and her ability to nag or persuade the king into marriage, but not Anne Boleyn. Instead, she entered politics. At first, Anne's political antics consisted of her manipulation of the established personal monarchy, therefore using her position of favor with the king. But over the course of the very late 1520s, she began collecting allies among members of the king's immediate entourage. By using these faction politics, any direct opposition of Anne Boleyn was impossible and dangerous. Though Anne's political prowess and support for her rose, there was still very little hope for a divorce granted by the Pope. It was Anne's nemesis, Cardinal Wolsey, who warned the Pope that many were insinuating to the king the necessity of adopting policies which would inevitably threaten the authority of Rome, but still the Pope did not grant Henry his divorce. Things began to progress very quickly by 1531 when Henry and Anne took things into their own hands by banishing Catherine of Aragon from court. A year later, the break from the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Supreme Church of England was finalized. Finally, after a long and frustrating engagement, Anne and Henry were married. The secret wedding took place in January 1533, and in May, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was declared null and void, and his marriage to Anne Boleyn was declared good and valid. To make things even better for the newlyweds, Anne was pregnant. On June 1st, 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England with St. Edward's crown. This crown was used only for monarchs, but it was not just a crown for Anne. It was the crown for the son and heir all were sure was in her belly. The long-awaited child was born on September 7, 1533, but it was a daughter, and they named her Elizabeth. A daughter did not only disappoint Anne, but it threatened her security on the throne. Henry had believed his sonless marriage with Catherine had been a sign from God of the marriage's invalidity, and if Anne could give no son to Henry, it would mean the same for theirs. Despite this, however, Anne and Henry had a decent marriage in the beginning. There was even a moment of relief for Anne with the news of the unexpected death of Catherine of Aragon in January 1536. But that news was only followed by a miscarriage weeks later. After the loss of the baby, what some believed would have been her savior, Anne could now only rely on her personal relationship with Henry to ensure her security. But with his growing fondness of Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, there was not much left of their relationship. All seemed hopeless then. She had no son, none of the political standing Catherine had had, nor the support, and even Anne's own vivid, stubborn personality, which had been ideal for a mistress, was now not ideal for a wife. She had all this against her, as well as her enemies, who acted quickly. Early in April, the king merely sought divorce, but then things took a turn when investigations of treason began later that month. On the 30th, the first arrest was made. 6 people, including Thomas Wyatt and George Boleyn, who was Anne's own brother, were dead, all accused of treason for having relationships with the queen. 3 weeks after the first arrest, and less after all those deaths, on May 17th, Anne Boleyn was executed. With one blow of the axe, generations of social climbing, years of learning, loving, and fighting were all seemingly washed away. Yet Anne Boleyn left her mark on the world. Hers is a story of passion, politics, tragedy, and she herself was a person of mystery, uniqueness, and flair. She gave birth to Elizabeth I, Gloriana, who is said to have been the best English monarch of all time. Anne Boleyn has left a huge impression on history, and though Henry VIII might have so easily forgotten her, we will not.